Good morning or afternoon, wherever you're sitting in the world today. And thank you so much for joining us for our first Community Speaker of the Year, Dr. Al with Verdant Consulting. She is the founder and CEO of an award-winning company here to talk about psychological safety and well-being. And what I'm particularly excited about, I mentioned to Dr. Al before we started today, is that this is very much a proactive approach. And we are the insurance industry and we need to practice what we preach. So I am so excited to introduce Dr. Al and Ruvi today here to talk about it. So Dr. Al and Ruvi, take it away.
Thank you so much. I'm happy to be here and so excited to talk about this with your members and discuss how we can connect belonging around psychological safety. So as you mentioned, I'm the CEO of Verdant Consulting. We certify companies as being psychologically safe against the World Health Organization's global guidelines and support businesses in creating proactively safe workplaces for mental health. Our team is made up of, we have affiliates around the globe and covering pretty much every industry. And one of those affiliates is with us today. So Ruvi, if you wouldn't mind introducing yourself before we begin.
Thank you, Dr. Al, and hello, everyone. My name is Ruvi Makuni, and I specialize in stress management training for organizations and individuals. And just as a quick question, how is everyone feeling as far as stress on a level of 5 being very stressed and 1 being pretty calm? I'd love to see it in the chat if you don't mind. 6. Oh, wow. Okay.
Do I get to vote? Because I'm definitely a 5. I'm definitely
5. Oh.
Although working with people who, we have shared values, shared interests, it's going down to a 4, I'll have to say.
Good. And you're traveling, Dr. Al, so that definitely bumps up the stress.
Yeah, lack of sleep. Yeah. How about you, Ruvi? Where are you?
I'm at a 4, but it's short-term stress when doing presentations, but afterwards, I'll be calm. That's great.
So our focus today is we're going to talk about some of the new perspectives that are evolving globally around mental health in the workplace. Again, looking at it from a very proactive point of view. And then we're going to apply those new frameworks to looking at inclusion and belonging and how that can impact both employees in your own organization, as well as clients and other businesses that you partner with. And you can use this information to help connect things that may be disconnected from each other: ESG, mental health and well-being, DEIB, and various other areas of focus. And we're going to talk about how to get started on this journey. So I always like to talk about the context of psychological safety as not being new. Many people think that it's new. They think it just came out in the last 5-10 years, but actually the concepts of psychologically safe workplaces have been around for over 100 years. I use this study as a great example. Mary Von Cleek, back in 1925, did a research paper on a flour company that had changed management. And she saw there was a difference in performance from the old management to the new, and she was trying to find out what made it different. And these 3 things were some of the ways in which the new management was able to help evolve by having more personal connection, higher context and creativity in the jobs, and increased job security. But many of us, when we think about psychological safety, we think about either Amy Edmondson's TED Talk or in the Fearless Organization, or this Google study that came out in 2015. That study, they did a 2-year study looking at all the teams around Google to see what differentiated high-performing teams from other teams. And you can see here the 5 areas that they identified in that 2-year study. The number 1 was psychological safety. So Ruvi, when have you done your best work?
Well, to share a personal story, when I was in college, I was working part-time at a front desk of a hotel. And I remember, working in a hotel is very, very stressful. But I remember the supervisor and manager that we had, they made it their priority to create a very safe environment where, you know, they had an open door policy. And especially when we dealt with challenges as far as guests were concerned and what have you, they really sat down with us to talk about, you know, how we were feeling and not to internalize the job stress. And I'll never forget that job, because both the supervisor and the manager actually left within 2 weeks, and we got a whole new team in, and it was a complete, you know, 180. It was such a shift. And then of course a lot of us ended up leaving, but it really, and it's been, you know, a long time since that job, but I will never forget that job because it's probably the safest place I've ever felt. And to this question, even when we had to do overtime or work longer, you know, back-to-back days because we were short-staffed, it was never a question, because we wanted, you know, we wanted the team to succeed because we all felt, you know, supported, and that came from management down.
Absolutely. Thank you for sharing that. I'm curious, for our participants who've joined us, anybody want to share either in the chat or come off mute and share when you've done your best work?
I can come off mute for this one. Ruvi, I love that story because of the support piece. I think that's so key. And my story was when I worked in a home office setting. It was my first time there, and I was like the first new employee in this department in a very long time. But we had a new manager, and she kind of looked at me and she goes, "You know what? Here's your work, and I know you're getting it done. If you see anything that you'd like to change, just start doing it." And she really just let me kind of create my own autonomy, create my own work. And that was the most supported I'd ever felt, because she recognized what I was capable of doing and let me do it.
Amazing. That autonomy, we're going to come back to that autonomy and empowerment in a little bit. But thank you for sharing that. You know, it's interesting. People ask me, you know, well, what pushback do you get about focusing on workplace mental health? And the easiest way to determine whether or not this is a worthwhile investment is for us to answer this question: when have we done our best work? Chances are it wasn't when we were stressed, overly stressed, where we felt undervalued, where we felt we didn't belong, where, you know, where we didn't feel supported. The descriptors that we get, in fact, and the answer to this question correlate very closely to having a psychologically safe workplace pretty consistently. And so because the science actually backs up the benefits, not just the research study that Google did, but decades and decades of research around stress in the workplace, business performance, organizational psychology has shown that creating psychologically healthy or safe workplaces, just like it does for physical health, for mental health, when we create the psychosocial safety within those workplaces, we see improved performance, improved retention, improved quality of product and service. So ISO, who most of us know through like total quality management, other things like that, in 2021, they published a guideline for having a psychologically healthy and safe workplace as part of occupational health and safety. So again, just like, you know, 30 years we were talking about bump caps and, you know, electric slips and falls, things like that. We're looking at the same thing, but from a psychological health point of view. And again, from an insurance point of view, it's all in service to diminishing risk. So just this last fall, we also saw published two things that I think are worth mentioning. Number one was the World Health Organization came out with their guidelines for workplace mental health and proactively creating a healthy workplace. And then Ruvi, you've probably seen this one from the Surgeon General. Do you want to share a little bit more about that?
Yes, this was also released last fall, Workplace Mental Health and Wellbeing Framework. This was really based on the study and research showing that 81% of workers reported that they will be looking for workplaces that support mental health in the future. And 84% of respondents said their workplace conditions had contributed to at least one mental health challenge. So this is not something that, you know, we we can ignore. And out of curiosity, from these research, we also, I'm not sure if you saw it, Dr. Al, but it also highlighted the top, or how countries rank as far as mental health. Does anyone want to take a guess which country in the world currently prioritizes or is recognized as prioritizing mental health the most?
And oh gosh, I don't know the answer to this. I'm going to guess one of the Nordic countries. Norway.
Close. Any other guesses? It starts with an S.
Sweden.
Finland was top. Yes, Sweden. That's right. Sweden, Germany, and I believe Finland was number 3. So whoever said, Elisa, you're correct. So
Awesome.
yes, so this is really worldwide. This is something that is being acknowledged and recognized worldwide. So what is psychological safety? It is the belief that you will not be punished, shamed, or have a negative fallout as a result of speaking up, asking questions, raising concerns, or making mistakes. And this is really part of the culture of a company. It's not just a one and done training and, once a year. This really has to be something not only from the leadership, but also filtered down into the team as well. So it's a whole company dynamic.
Yeah, and I think often people get confused and think, oh, psychological safety means no conflict, no disagreement. Everyone's, everybody gets a prize, no, we can't perform, we can't hold people accountable. And it's actually the opposite of that. One of the professor who joined me on a roundtable last year, she spoke about it too, which I'll share.
Psychological safety doesn't mean it's never scary to raise a counterpoint or speak up, right? So it just means that you don't believe that the people around you will automatically reassess their value or interpretation of who you are as a person. It's the ability to speak up, knowing that the basic assumption that others have about who you are remains intact. Meaning, if my basic assumption about you is that you are genuinely a decent person who is a team player, is trying to do the right thing, and is genuinely trying to understand and move our organization forward, then you might make a comment here or there, suggest an idea that's a little off the wall, or maybe it's not really accurate, and I'm not reevaluating that basic assumption of you. And I think that's really at the heart of what psychological safety is.
I love how she describes that too, right? Is that I'm not reevaluating my assumptions about you. So go ahead.
Sorry, and what about, human basic needs is feeling safe. And, if we're spending 90% of our adult lives in the workplace, we want to feel safe and we want to belong.
Yeah, absolutely. So as we think about, diversity, equity, inclusion, belonging, it's really about who is welcome, who has access, who is heard, and who feels accepted, said simply. So the reason why we want to focus on that and how that ties to mental health is when we have a lack of belonging, feeling of a lack of belonging, our sense of inauthenticity, not being able to be ourselves, increases significantly, as you can see here. And then if we feel excluded, right, that we don't feel heard or have access, our anger and sadness increases emotionally, none of which is healthy for the workplace. So when we look at these global guidelines we've been talking about, ISO, World Health Organization, et cetera, it really is broken down into these 3 areas. What are the structures in the organization and how do they either help or hinder mental health? How is the environment? What hazards might exist in the environment? Again, not that we can remove them, but how do we mitigate their impact? And then what are the expectations of behavior, which are very similar to what we saw from the Google study. So I want to talk a little bit about the structures within an organization, because we tend to, when we think about psychological safety or psychological health in the workplace, we tend to go straight to the behavior of people, but there are other factors that can actually accelerate the risks of burnout and other mental health issues. And so the World Health Organization identifies these as some of the examples of structures that are important to look at and understand, because they create hazards in the workplace that can impact the mental health of our workforce. So let me give you some examples, and Ruby, you're going to share some too. So job design is a really good one. I often use this one because people will understand when I have meaningless work, then I'm less likely to be productive, right? And so that's something that is identified in the literature as being a psychosocial hazard. One of those pieces was around collaboration, right? The need to collaborate and work with other people. This study that actually just came out this year showed that my psychological stress decreased the more I was able to collaborate with other people in role. And think about this, Ruby, right? Here we are, we're collaborating. That makes this less stressful, right?
Definitely.
You want to talk about culture?
Yes, culture is definitely another element to it, particularly if we look at the point of frequent changes, especially when it lacks communication, constant changes and high competition. So there are two areas to look at this, or two approaches. As far as competition, whether it's, within performance, promotions and things like that. But there's another element to competition where, if we take the example of a company that's facing layoffs, for example, then competition starts to arise within the team. Maybe you don't want to make mistakes, or now there's lack of cohesiveness or collaboration anymore because everyone, you're competing for your job, so to speak. So that can, of course, and then of course you don't feel safe. There's no job security as well. And
Absolutely.
then, bullying and discrimination, something that we've seen a lot, and obviously that's you don't feel safe there as well. So that's really all part of the culture, and scarce resources and politics and bureaucracies as well.
Yeah, all of those things. I mean, it's often called toxic workplaces, but we may ignore things like, or even believe that the high competition, people kind of vying for the number one spot, it's a motivation, but over time, it creates a lot of emotional exhaustion. In fact, this study that came out last year showed that there was a 44% increase in emotional exhaustion in those highly competitive cultures. So while it might motivate to get the goals over the finish line, the aftermath of that is going to be pretty heavy and intense. And in fact, if we continue down looking at high competition, this study that came out in 2018 showed a big difference also between men and women, that the threat level or feeling of stress increased for men, especially around the concept of winners and losers. So, I mean, if people are in or out, those kind of things, that competition, it breeds that behavior. For women, what they encounter were more in highly competitive workplaces were more sexist work norms. So very clear divisions of men do this, women do that, etc. And so that increased in highly competitive workplaces. And so what they found is that also it increased the emotional exhaustion, etc. Okay, so we've looked at culture, but another one that I think people don't really think about as much is the workload or the pace of work. And so again, the World Health Organization, ISO, they call out things like having unrealistic deadlines as an accelerant for burnout in the workplace, or unsustainable workloads. Again, if we think about recent layoffs, for example, some of the fallout of that are people who are still at the company, having to carry the workload of the people who've been exited. Schedules are also an impact on mental health. Again, what we're talking about is not eradicating these hazards, because some of them are unavoidable. You may have a 24-hour workplace, right? I worked for a retailer that was open 24 hours. We can't not be open at night. But what we can do is understand what the risks are for that negatively impacting people's mental health, and then provide resources or other tools to keep them safe. Go ahead, Ruvi, on this one. The role, how might a role in the organization impact your mental health?
Well, lack of clarity on, your role, and this could look the two approaches to it. When we talk about layoffs, we're finding that positions are sort of being merged, and so there's lack of clarity as far as what's my new role now. Still doing the same position, but maybe the workload has increased, or perhaps even starting a new job at an organization that hasn't really defined what the role is, or there hasn't been much clarity as far as that's concerned. And so you literally, if you make mistakes, that's going to be without any clarity on your job. It puts you on edge, basically, if there's no clarity as far as that's concerned. Or having multiple managers, not knowing who's your direct contact in the organization, and responsibility for other people. I think this also is key if there isn't sufficient training, perhaps, or sufficient, communication as well. So that could definitely play a role in that.
Yeah, absolutely. So that's actually my favorite bullet is to talk about, is because responsibility for other people are things like our roles, such as being a leader in an organization. I just did a post on this morning that there's a bunch of studies on leader mental health, and everywhere between 53% to 78%, depending on the study, of executives have symptoms of mental health issues. And that happens because of the weight and load of leading other people, which is something we don't often talk about. So I'm curious to the group who's on the call, how many of these have you encountered? Would anybody like to share one that maybe they've experienced, maybe not where they are now, but in the past?
I'll chime in again. I feel like I've experienced a fair amount of these, but I would say role ambiguity tends to be one that is really stressful, because if you don't know exactly what it is that you're supposed to do, you don't know how you'll be held accountable. I experienced that in an agency setting, and I felt that I was starting to work to avoid conflict or work to avoid punishment instead of doing my job, because I was so afraid of how that would be perceived.
Absolutely. I'm also noticing there's a typo there, but that we should have caught. But yes, that ambiguity, not knowing what good looks like or how you'll be measured, especially if you only talk about your performance once a year, you're doing this kind of guess what I'm thinking game that just is very unproductive. So thank you for sharing that.
And that tied in with having multiple managers. And if you don't know, and if there's lack of communication between the managers too, you might be receiving different information from each one. And that can, of course, cause confusion and conflict as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Another area that they talk about, and this was in the study we saw from the flour factory back in 1925, is control, sense of control over the work. And I think we were talking about one of the people on the call shared earlier about, if you see a change that you think would make us better, make it, right? We like to be, as human adults, we need authority, agency over the work we do. And not having that control can be very, very stressful, especially when decisions are made that impact us, that we don't have a chance to either understand or weigh in on. And so being empowered to make decisions at the closest to the work often can be a way to proactively prevent mental health issues. In fact, when people had high psychological safety and high self-leadership, in other words, were able to make decisions about their role, their sense of meaningfulness in the work they did. And we know that meaningfulness drives engagement, it drives what they're called citizenship behaviors, it drives all kinds of great outcomes when I feel like the work I'm doing is meaningful.
In some point of the history of labor, of industry, we forgot that there are human beings working at the factories. We forgot, I don't know why, because maybe we need to be very productive back then, and we treat us like machines, and still we do. So I think that this challenge that we have right now is to humanize the industry, to bring back that aware that we are human beings, that we have we have feelings, we have emotions, we have all this, and obviously we can create something different.
So people are talking about the future of work a lot, right? And how has work changed? I think many of us feel that work has changed. People become more vocal about their needs. They've been have raised the bar and expectations of employers as it comes to workplace flexibility, mental health being one of those, and creating healthy workplaces. Claudio is a great example of somebody who supports organizations within countries that have national guidelines. So Mexico requires a psychological safety audit every 2 years for their workplaces. Canada has had a psychological health and safety requirement for its employers since 2007. The UK and Australia also have that. So we see that shift in mindset of looking at the workers in our workplaces as humans and understanding that humans have needs that are not like those of machines. And those are both physical and psychological. Okay, so we've looked at the structures. Let's talk about some of the things outside of the workplace that are beyond your control, such as the environment or things that impact it. So some examples of things that could potentially impact the mental health of a workplace is things like vendor instability, right? If we have a high dependency on a supplier or our supply chain delivery company, and they're not meeting those needs or doing well, that can have blowback to the company. Any kind of work that's high risk work, high competition in the marketplace where there's limited talent, external influences like political destabilization. We'll talk about some of that. None of these are things that we as companies can necessarily eradicate, but what we need to do is be able to identify what those are, the risk that they impact our employees, make adjustments where we can, and educate where we can't. So I think about it this way, excuse me. If I was a company that was responsible for window washing high-rise buildings, I can't make the building shorter. I can't say, oh, we only do it, 2 stories or below. I have to equip my workers with the safety training and tools to help prevent them falling, right? And an injury. It's the same thing with understanding what the hazards are in our workplaces and the risks, so we can mitigate the impact those have on our employees, even if they're beyond our control.
Yes, and if you've noticed, job search programs now have also added motivational resources. And the primary reason for that is that any unemployment of any nature, whether it's layoffs or, losing a job for whatever reason, has been known to impact individuals' mental health. And what's interesting is that I was reading that layoffs most of the time have actually, I believe it was about 40%, I'll have to confirm that, but they actually have very little to do with the individual's performance. But most people take that on as it was their fault. And over time, and of course, depending on the length of unemployment, can definitely have an impact on an individual's self-esteem in terms of searching for a job or even starting a new job. Also anxiety, because there's that lingering feeling that what if this happens again, just not knowing that, not feeling safe at a new company, and feeling excluded as well, not feeling as part of the team. And also that bias that may come into play whenever any sort of changes start happening at the company. So this is an area that could actually be considered in that as well.
Yeah, so this is why things like returnships are so helpful, because it understands the context of, again, I'm not going to not hire people who were previously unemployed. That seems silly, but I want to understand that when I hire someone who's coming back, especially from a long unemployment, or maybe they took time off to care for a sick family member, et cetera, there are certain things I need to be aware of as it relates to creating an inclusive environment, workplace, and really deepening their sense of belonging. So understanding where they're coming from is important. So let me give you some examples of what this might look like. Let's say we're going through an organizational change and we're going to be placing that person in a new role. So they may respond with lowered self-esteem of, I don't think I can learn this. This is too much of a risk, or maybe they're too worried about the pending changes to focus on the work at hand and they get distracted. They may feel like, oh, well, everyone else must have known and I don't. I feel out of the loop because I feel excluded, and those biases that can come up, such as negativity bias, as an example of any change is bound to be bad. And so again, being aware of these risks and then baking that into our change management plan can help us create more of a psychologically healthy workplace. Another area that a lot of companies are talking about, and that's coming up in the media, is the concept of trauma-informed workplaces or trauma-informed leadership. And so what this does is it bakes in a lot of the things we're already talking about, but with the understanding that a large percent of our adult population in the US has experienced some form of trauma. So research shows that about 65% of US adults had a traumatic childhood event. And that's during the developmental years of our brains. Our brains develop up until the time we're 27, approximately. And all of that embeds our neural pathways and how we process information, how our biases that can show up for us, et cetera. But let's just also add to that all of the different things that can impact our mental health, either through work or outside of work as we move into adulthood. So workplace trauma, for example, experiencing a huge layoff. We talked about the mental health impacts of that, observing bullying or harassment. There's a lot of things that can happen in the workplace that can create traumatic experiences from a psychological perspective. Another one that I find very fascinating is cyber attacks. So recent research shows that cyber attacks, and I work with some cybersecurity companies where this is important to know, cyber attacks often have the same reaction emotionally as physical attacks. So what they're seeing is people who work in cybersecurity after a cyber attack on their business, they have PTSD symptoms. Secondary trauma, depending on where you work, the industry you work, the work you do, you may experience taking on the trauma of other people's traumatic events. And then the big one is natural disasters. And so the World Health Organization actually says, so does the American Psychological Association and many other universities and researchers in mental health say that the biggest threat to mental health globally is actually climate change. So when we experience natural disasters, that has a stress impact and can cause post-traumatic stress. But we also have existential stress about the future of our planet. I'm curious, Ruby, have you seen some of these things come up for the people that you work with in the work that you do?
Yes, definitely. I think, all the challenges from 2020 are still really lingering. I mean, there were so many things that, from layoffs that we're seeing now on either workplace conflict or, relocations. And I'm still seeing a lot of the impacts of 2020, seeing that now, and definitely workplace trauma as it relates to conflict and bullying. It seems to be on the rise. And and lack of clarity as to what to do. Who do you go to for that? Who do you go to for that? So I think that's definitely what I'm seeing.
Yeah, I'm curious from the group, those on the call, have you seen these kinds of traumas impact people in your circles?
Yeah, I can especially speak to the cyber attacks, working in the IT industry, having my background there, and seeing how some very disastrous events, a meltdown in the data center, everybody's scrambling. And while you work to fix it as quickly as you can, there are repercussions of that event that even a year later, it's still on people's minds. It's still a threat of, did we do what we had to? Is it taken care of? Are we going to be singled out for anything? There's a lot of different things that can come from that situation, and calling that out as the PTSD that it really is. But that's something that I think people, especially in that IT sector, will carry with them. So I really like the cyber attack call out here.
Thank you for that. So if we can stick on that for a second, let's use this as an example of what we're talking about, right? So we know this to be true. We've studied cyber attacks and the impact that it has on the IT workforce. Okay, so we know that that's a hazard. How do we mitigate the risk? Well, one would be not having the attacks. Great. But another one would be to maybe inform people, hey, this might be stressful for you. So let's build some coping mechanisms of how you handle that stress, or what you do afterwards, putting into place things where we're more aware of the hazards, just like we would think about a physical hazard in the workplace. If, hey, be careful if it's wet here, we put up a sign. Hey, this has been shown to put people at risk mental health wise. So here's some things to watch out for, right? So we're kind of trying to approach it in a very similar way. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. So good.
Thank you. Okay, so
Dr. Because what tends to happen sometimes is, situations happen and we move on to the next. But I love that, having that proactive approach and conversation and providing support ahead of time as well, that if this happens, or when this happens, or if this happens again, here's the support, here's how we handle it as a team, and so I think I love that.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, it's kind of like, doing a fire drill, right? We know where to go. We know where a muster station is. It's the same thing, but from psychological hazards. So as you can see here, trauma-informed approaches are very similar to the things we've been talking about. People need to feel safe. They need to feel like they can trust others to not, to be able to support or follow up on their commitments to each other. They want to feel like they have choice in making decisions that impacts them. They like to collaborate and partner in order to create trust, and they want to be empowered to make decisions. All right, so now let's talk about the expectations of behavior and how that enforces workplace psychological safety. So kind of the things we just talked about are very similar to what's been called workplace social courage. And you can see here, this study looked at ways in which we can improve performance, people willing to take risks, people having courage, but what they called workplace social courage, I thought was really important and pertinent, because if you look at those bullets there of how we define it, it's the behaviors we've been talking about the whole time. And so what they've found in research around courage at work is that we as individuals can invest in, kind of make deposits in the trust and psychological safety bank, so to speak, that will pay off dividends down the road. And according to the research, there are 4 ways that we can, as individuals, build courage in the workplace create a workplace that fosters that courage. This study from the Tavistock Institute looked at workplace social courage. last year, and they showed an increase in courage when we do these 4 things. Some of them are probably going to look familiar, but Ruvi and I are going to talk about, okay, well, what actions can I take at an individual level to be able to foster the type of workplace that we're talking about. So one is to create connection. So a lot of times we do this by having shared mission, as an organization, having shared values. But the other ways are to create inclusion, where people can be a part of the conversation, and create belonging, where they feel like they're valued. And so when we create that connection within the organization, that creates the courage to be able to take the risks of raising questions, disagreeing, etc. In fact, when we have shared vision, this study from 2018 showed that we had a 57% higher performance, and our customer satisfaction increased almost by half. So that shared vision, when we're all moving in the same direction, has a huge impact on business outcomes. So one thing to think about is, what vision do you share within your workplace? And for the clients you work with, do they have a shared vision that they communicate well to the organization?
And another area of building courage is relate. And this really connected more to communication, or authentic communication, and active listening. Earlier we saw the video about human beings, and this comes into really communicating and understanding each other as humans. And this can look as active listening, authentic curiosity when having conversations in teams. And on the next slide, we'll show some ways of doing that and not doing that. So avoiding being too busy, putting, for example, if you're talking to colleagues, maybe putting the phone away, turning off that phone, and actually having engaged conversations. Less surface talk, but more actually trying to understand what's going on with colleagues. Avoiding oversharing or making assumptions too about any discussions or situations that might be going on with a colleague, particularly if they're looking, disengaged. Sometimes it's easy to make assumptions that, they're not doing their job, but it could be a deeper issue. So some approaches to actually block off time. And I would actually add that in this virtual remote work structure that we're going into, or that we're primarily in for a lot of companies, I think this is really important to actually make time, to block off time to have those conversations one-on-one with team members, because it's so hard to connect now. Ask questions, not just how are you, but ask those questions that facilitate open-ended questions. What's a great question, Dr. Al, other than how are you? Or anyone would like to share, what's a great question other than how are you doing? Because we know that we have a default answer to that. I'm doing great. We want to facilitate those open questions. What's impacting your day today? Yes, exactly. I like that one. And also discussing shared interests and change in perspective as well. So
yeah.
Sorry, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
But really just real communication and getting to know, and that really is a sense of belonging when you feel like someone actually cares enough to ask how you're doing, more than the surface level discussions or conversations.
Yeah, and it cares about the answers. So one thing to think about is, what's a connection that needs work in your workplace? Like, who's that one person that pops to mind that maybe that connection's not working in a way that you would like it to be? You don't feel as like you can relate to them. There's some distrust maybe there. What can you do to reach out and start building those relationship backgrounds, trying to create that connection? All right, so our third piece that we can do when it comes to building courage is collaboration. Now, we've talked about collaboration being correlated to higher mental health at the workplace. So when we work together, we tend to do better work. I mean, and really, if you think about the history of human beings, right, we are social creatures who also think. We very rarely, historically, spent time alone. And so working with is a big part of building courage and trust. And so, leaning on the strengths of other people, making sure we have balanced voices that we hear from a belonging perspective is important. And what we're trying to do when we collaborate is we're creating a shared history. And we have that shared history, have those shared stories where we're creating ways to work together that make it safer to take risks. And that's our investment in future risk taking. In fact, when we collaborate together, this study showed that we increase our trust, we increase our workplace satisfaction, and our innovation improves because we're able to bounce ideas around with each other. So one thing you can think about to get started on this is what strengths do you have that you can share with other people? And what strengths do you need support with? And find those opportunities to create collaborative exchanges.
And support, something that I always share as far as empathy is concerned, because I see it time and time again. Unfortunately, at some point, most of us will unfortunately lose someone, and what tends to happen is a family member or a colleague loses a loved one and they get the bereavement leave, which is usually 3 or 4 days, and then they come back to work and maybe they get flowers and that's the end of that. I definitely think building some sort of support, ongoing support, for people that are dealing with any kind of loss, whether it's divorce or loss of a pet or loss of a loved one. I think that is so key because people just kind of push on, and feel alone in that regard. And also offering appreciation is another great one. March, there's Employee Appreciation Day. I believe it's March 3rd. So showing appreciation for each other on that day, but not only that specific day, but just in general, small acts of kindness and the surprise kindness, I think is great as well, just offering support and sharing resources and assistance as well. And this support is interesting because a lot of people don't ask for help. And so some key areas, how do you identify who might need help? Perhaps someone that never takes time to take a break, they're always busy, but they've sort of become distant from the team. Someone who's never on camera, in this virtual world, maybe you haven't seen them for a long time, on camera. Someone who maybe perhaps always making mistakes, especially if that's not common, if it's recently started, or late delivery of work, or forgetfulness as well. Basically, a change in behavior in some nature needs some sort of support, whether it's more direction, more training, or something else might be going on that they need support with.
So a great place to start is think about who could use your support, who might be struggling that you could reach out to and check in on, who can you help today? What can you give back? Who could use an introduction that would be useful to them? Who could use a tool that you found that has helped make your work better? All of those things, again, by giving to others, we actually are able to improve our own sense of well-being as well.
Many countries around the world have standards and laws relative to how you ensure the psychological and psychosocial safety of employees at work. It's a requirement. We don't have that here. It is still legal to bully people here. It is still legal to mistreat people as long as you don't do it to the wrong person who's involved in protected class activity or in a protected class himself. So our systems are insufficient. And on top of that, we have a kind of an individualistic type of culture that doesn't seem to understand that, and I'm an individualist as well. I really believe in self-sufficiency. There's a lot of things I can do on my own. The challenge is I limit what I can do if it's only on my own. I feel like I'm very smart. I feel like I'm very capable, blah, blah, blah. But there are some things I have to have other people. I can't build roads by myself. I can't ensure that my air is clean by myself. I'm not my own military. So we need other people for lots of things. And I think sometimes we have these binary choice type perspectives or zero sum focuses, have this zero sum game focus that suggests that it has to be this or that. I believe it has to be this and that. I believe that we should have an environment that is physically safe for me, but is also psychologically safe for me.
And so speaking of, as I mentioned, globally, different countries have put into place those requirements, those national requirements, looking at the level of risk that occurs when we don't have psychological safety. And so this is from the World Health Organization. They talk about all the things we just spoke about, exposure to those psychosocial risks at work. They also talk about educating your managers and employees on mental health and well-being at work. And I want to share a last video before we go to questions is from a friend of mine, Susanna. She was involved with the World Health Organization through the International Labor Organization. They partnered with WHO to create these guidelines. And here's her perspective about what we're seeing.
There are all of these things which have brought us to a situation which is completely unsustainable. And what I think is that we are at the threshold of a really massive shift in, it's almost like an industrial revolution. For me, that we have to take psychosocial well-being seriously.
And so in taking it seriously, that's what you've been doing today by learning about all of these things. So we shared some ideas on where to start individually. But as an organization, here's what the UN says. They say that we need to raise awareness, identify hazards and risks, and equip leaders with skills and resources. If you're interested, you can reach out to me. I'll put my contact information at the end. We have a psychological safety risk check-in that you can use to see how safe your workplace is. And then what's most important here is also don't forget about you. Pay attention to your own needs, especially as you support clients, you're doing work that maybe stretches you. If you're responsible for others or you're a leader, make sure that you're taking care of yourself so that you can take care of others. If you're a driver of change, make sure that you yourself aren't experiencing change fatigue. So build your awareness of how you're doing so that you can help others. All right, so to sum up, we talked about some of the new perspectives that are happening globally around workplace mental health, some of the risks of organizational design, as well as other factors, and how to get started. As I shared, my name is Dr. Alessandra Polizzi. I am on LinkedIn. I'm also on TikTok. Both Ruvi and I are on LinkedIn. So if you have any questions or want to follow up, if you'd like that check-in, feel free to reach out. And with that, I would like to stop sharing and open up for questions.
I love that you immediately went into how people can engage with you, because that was definitely going to be a question of mine. The work that you do, I think, is incredibly important. And I think that came through with both you and Ruvi today. So thank you so much for your time. And I know you shared a couple of ideas, but I want to hone in on this a little bit, because something that we're hearing from leaders and managers time and time again is the absolute overwhelm in this environment. And yeah, I can see the shaking of heads, because we know that this feeling is ever present. So if you're talking to a leader that is just looking at the scope of all of this and going, where do we start? How do we get started? If I can just do one thing and start small, like what would your suggestion be for that first little bit of movement so that they can start?
Well, I always say, start by understanding and appreciating how hard the world and the work you do is now, and practice some self-compassion. So give yourself a break, right? But then you don't have to go this alone. You can use resources, companies like ours that specialize in this area and can hold your hand through the whole process and make it a less heavy lift. But the first thing is to say, I am not broken because I happen to have emotions at work. The thought that we turn off our emotions when we're at work is delusional at best. That's not how our brains are wired. Of course, we experience emotional reactions to work, and we take stuff personally. So that denial is starting to shift to an understanding and appreciation of, just like we look at physical health, we need to look at psychological health, and it's okay that I have needs.
So a phrase that comes to mind for me is, I'm not needy, I have needs.
That's right.
Yep. And so for individuals that are looking at what you're doing here, how could they engage with you if maybe their companies aren't on board, or they don't know how to ask? How could they engage with you outside of social media? I know you have that checklist. Is there any other way they could engage with you?
Yeah, so our website, verdantconsulting.net, we have a lot of resources. There's a tab that says make the case. That does an ROI calculator if you're trying to make the case. Under use cases, there are a bunch of different industries and different situations where this could apply. We also offer a burnout inventory if you're concerned that perhaps you have burnout, and lots of resources on our website. And that's why I talk about building courage, is because sometimes as individuals we feel powerless to make change. The best thing you can do is practice that self-compassion and then do all those things we talked about. Ruvi, what would you add?
Yes, to add to that, something that's small, simple changes sometimes we overlook. So for leaders, in fact, it actually sets such a wonderful example, and it's great for them too, to take those breaks, take those lunch breaks, switch off at nighttime, set off those time limits as well, encourage vacations. I mean, these are things that we tend to overlook. They sound so simple, but my goodness, are they effective? And again, that brings back the point that we all have emotions, we all get tired, we all need a break. And, things like that could make a dramatic difference. Even it can change the culture of the company too.
Yeah, great ad.
Yeah, I love that. So I got to ask now, because you both called it out earlier, what's your stress level at now?
It's at probably like a 3.
Okay.
Yeah, I love talking about this, right? This is my, how about you, Ruby? How are you doing?
I'm good because the tech performed well. Yeah, and my cat didn't come across the screen, so I'm good.
You know what? And I know you called out an error on one of the slides, but something at IE that we love to do is just be really human. And so if your cat showed up, we would love that. We're big pet people. And you know what? We're human and we make mistakes. So like the grace, right? So my goodness, Dr. Al, Ruvi, it's been, we do have one more question real quick.
From the last 2 years.
Here, I'll read it out loud for everybody real quick if you want. Yeah. It says, out of curiosity, many of the reports shown were from the last 2 years. What does the timeline look like for mental health awareness in the workplace? And what kind of traction or development are you seeing recently? Great question.
Yeah, absolutely. So actually, the reason why I picked things in the last 2 years is, for me, the world changed, right? 2020, the world changed. And so I try not to lean on things kind of in the before times. However, as I mentioned, Canada has had their national standards since 2007. These conversations started in the 90s as far as workplace mental health. And within occupational health and safety, it's actually always been there. It's just that we haven't specifically focused on it. So if you look at the ISO 45001, which is the occupational health and safety standard, it has physical and mental health included, and that's been around since the 80s.
Fantastic. Dr. Al, Ruvi, thank you so much for your time today. Please, community, check out Verdant Consulting, check out those burnout lists. I know I will be doing that after we get off the call today. This recording will be available on our YouTube channel as soon as we can get it edited, but please do check out their work and support them and thank them for what they're doing. So it's been an honor and a pleasure. Thank you for being here, and we'll see you next time.
Thanks so much for having
Thank
us.
you. Bye.